Hi, can we begin, Vijiraj? Are we waiting for?
Hi, Indradeep. Good afternoon.
Hi, Gigi. Can we begin? Should we begin?
Maybe another 2-3 minutes more because we
Okay,
just
okay, yeah, no problem. Just let us know when to
yeah,
begin.
sure. Another 2-3 minutes. I speak. This is all. Meeting this is the no. दे रहा हूँ अरे दे रहा हूँ Can we start, Indradeep? Dheeraj?
Yes, we can start. So, welcome everyone. I'm Indradeep. I'm Executive Director of Dvara Research, and my colleagues Vijiraj Bhattacharya and Priyadarshini Ganeshan are here with me, and we are going to present to you the work that we did with Sa-Dhan last year uh, between February 2024 and September 2024. So, Vijraj, I'll hand it over to you and Priya.
Before that, let me just give a small introduction. Thank you, Indradeep and Dheeraj and Priyadarshini and the team from Dwara. And thank you all the members from Microfinance Institution who have joined this webinar. Good afternoon to all. In fact, see, we know that in 2022, the RBI came up with a new regulatory framework. I can say it was a watershed moment as far as microfinance is concerned, because the regulatory framework which was in work from 2012 has been almost totally, I would say, revised and will given a lot of freedom to the microfinance institutions to decide their own policies and and uh, especially the lending policies, pricing policy, and all. So it was a real big change as far as microfinance is concerned, and we know that it has been useful and beneficial to most of the microfinance institutions, especially at a time when COVID impact was severe in the sector. So one of our meeting with Deputy Governor Sri Rajesh Rao, he suggested, why don't you have a study and understand how this new regulatory framework has impacted the lenders as well as the borrowers, and let us have a feedback on that. In that connection, we had a discussion with Dwara Research. Dwara Research is earlier it was known as IFMR Research. So they are very well known, especially in the microfinance segment, for their excellent work in research and all. So Indradeep heads that research side. So we had a discussion with him, and based on that only we did this study, and it has come out with a report. And we wanted to have this report presented in a stakeholders workshop, but unfortunately, because of certain reasons, especially the developments in Karnataka last quarter, we were all preoccupied with that and we could not do that. So then now we thought that we should have a webinar and present it for the members so that they can also understand. Some some of the findings are quite interesting and useful to the members, and some of them are quite insightful. So I will hand over to Indradeep and Viraj for taking it forward. I thank you once again for doing this study. Thank you. Over to you, Viraj.
Thank you, Ji. It was a pleasure working with the Sa-Dhan team, and I would like to firstly thank them for facilitating this surveys, the conversations, and giving us access to people that we could talk to. I'll just present my screen, and I'll then start walking us through the broad findings of the study. Please let me know if my screen is visible.
Yes, visible.
Oh, right. So, like Niji mentioned, what our conversation today will look at is the study that is titled Emerging Trends and Shifts in Microfinance. These together compile insights from multiple stakeholders and looks at specifically the impact of the Reserve Bank of India's microfinance regulatory framework in 2022. So broadly, the conversation today will be split in two parts. One, we will talk about what was the introduction, motivation behind the study, what did we set out to find. Second, what exactly we found, and what are the next steps therefrom. So in terms of what the study design looked um, like I mentioned, the objective was to understand the impact the new regulations had. And that understanding was split as inquiries across four different themes. Theme one, we wanted to understand how household income and repayment capacity assessment was done because there were substantive changes introduced to that segment. Theme two is around pricing, competition, and information disclosure. I'm sure everybody here would be aware that price caps were removed, which was expected to result into increased competition, and information disclosure regime was also strengthened to some extent. Theme three was around staff training, monitoring, how their performance are assessed, and so on. And finally, we looked at theme four, which is loan repayments and the recoveries. What are the lives of the households that the microfinance industry serves? What do they look like? So in terms of sample, we spoke with 13 members, MFIs of Sa-Dhan. And again, like I mentioned, I would like to extend a deep gratitude to the Sa-Dhan team for facilitating this. So these are split across four categories. We looked at four small MFIs, three medium MFIs, two large MFIs, and four very large MFIs. We go into the segments as to what the loan books look like in greater detail in the report. But these are broadly the sample parameters. We spoke with 30 respondents who represented the management. So these are CEOs, MDs, any other CXOs. So that would be the 30 respondents. The next 90 respondents are mostly field staff, starting from all the way to loan officer, to in certain cases, cluster manager, in certain cases, people who are overseeing a district. And finally, we had conversations with 771 customers across 10 MFIs. Now, these MFIs were spread all over. So we have a north, south, east, west representation. So it's not just clustered in one or two districts of the country, but rather the sample draws from 8 states across the world. As Indradeep mentioned, this study was conducted between February 2024 and September 2020. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this segment simply because the audience will know what are the changes that have happened in terms of regulatory provision. But to sum it up, what exactly we found before I go specifically into the findings it would be that in most cases, regulations were being followed. And in certain cases, what we also found that there was a good faith attempt was made to observe the regulatory mandates. But still, there are certain problems. For example, how do you measure it? It's a question that is not really new, but a question that has been there since the advent of microfinance, and specifically given the nature of employment and the informality of labor that we witness in the typical household that is a recipient of the microfinance loan. So there are different methods. We found somebody is using technology, somebody is relying on the field level insights from the field officer. So, but it's still a question mark and still a structural challenge that sort of remains. How are all liabilities being assessed? Are they really being accounted for? What we found is that yes, again, there has been a good faith attempt to do that, but the presence of multiple KYC IDs, two different bureaus saying two different things about the same borrower, data being, it's been taking 30 days to update new loans in the credit information system, and so on, are challenges that remain. Needless to say, of course, informal lending is something that is a black box, specifically when we start talking about the credit bureaus. Similarly, we had questions around whether this 3 lakh rupee income limit is appropriate pan-India. A rural household in, say, Bihar, vis-a-vis a household in Bangalore or Delhi, are they all falling under the 3 lakh limit, or should there be some changes? So there are certain questions that do emerge from the study, and we will go into more details around what are the answers we find. But in terms of where the study situates itself and what are the insights it can provide, it's a rare view into the industry dynamics and customers' life. Specifically, as we stand today, we know that there are certain headwinds that the industry faces. And this study looks at the period preceding the headwinds and during the inception of those headwinds. So what we are able to observe is how things panned out. What are the choices that MFI leaders are being forced to make? Primarily because every choice will have a trade-off. There are these trade-offs that we discuss. And then another question or other insight that we can get from this entire conversation is, where do we move forward from here? Because once we know what the state looks like, once we know what today's situation is, perhaps the study allows us to ask certain questions and answer them in terms of where can we go from here, what are the changes that we can do. So this is broadly what the conversation today is going to be about. In the next segment, what I'll look at are the study findings across the dimensions we discussed earlier, and then go into some of the possible next steps that we can think of. I'll request anybody to just stop me and interrupt in case there's a question. It'll be difficult for me to monitor the chat box. So in case you have questions, please feel free to interrupt. So starting off with household income assessment. So our observations are here divided into three broad features. One is macro. So these are the sectoral challenges. These are the problems that are generally playing out at a macro level, insofar as these are not necessarily operational friction, but are questions that of strategy that one must decide. And a lot of it also implicates the regulator, insofar as in terms of the regulatory design, is there need for any additional thinking on that front. So starting off with macro, what we find is that household income assessment remains a subjective exercise. There is no pay slip, there is no digital record of all the transactions that have happened. So it is essentially what the borrower tells the loan officer what their income is, but of course can be corroborated using different sources, but it remains a subjective exercise in its entirety. The data points employed to corroborate the self-reported incomes varied wildly. So you can do it in terms of assessing, okay, what are the assets that the borrower possesses, or can be done by looking at what is the typical livelihood, what is the employment that they have, and depending on those heuristics, figuring out what they might make in a year. And this, of course, relies heavily on the field staff's understanding of the micro-contextual features. And finally, the third part is around uniform household income limit of 3 lakhs. When we spoke with almost every CEO, what we heard is that it's a welcome change because the number was raised from the past regulation. But at the same time, this universal application may be a little difficult. But they were also sympathizing insofar as that, yes, there is a need to create a benchmark. However, imprecise such a benchmark may be. In the bottom of the slide, you're able to see some of the quotes that we have taken up from different conversations. So certain CEOs mentioned that income levels vary from region to region. Household income limit could be linked to state GDP or per capita income. Similarly, another CEO of a large MFI mentioned that household income remains difficult to assess. So that's on the macro side of things. On micro, how the macro is translating is that we don't have reliable income data. Informality, seasonality, and unpredictability of income sources continues to remain a problem. And operational considerations prohibit long questionnaire. Insofar as if you want to create a long questionnaire that is 2 hours or 3 hours long and might be able to give you a lot more detail as to how much they have spent on, let's say, buying cereals, vis-a-vis how much they have spent on buying clothes, and together you can triangulate perhaps. That remains operationally unfeasible um, at the current stage. So therefore, the outcomes that we find, this is when the provider's imperatives are now uh, interacting with the customers. So the outcomes that we find are that in certain cases where the income of the borrower is exceeding the prescribed limit, they are accommodated under the non-qualifying asset group. And in certain cases, we also find that there is a risk of either underreporting. So this is somebody who's earning, let's say, 5 lakh, but needs a microfinance loan. So they will say, okay, I only earn 2,90,000. So there is this case of underreporting, or there is a case of over-reporting where somebody wants a higher loan amount. So they over-report their income. And similarly, the same principle applies to their expenses. So this is what we found in terms of household assessment, household income assessment. Moving to the next theme, this is around repayment capacity assessment. So how the income assessment varies from repayment capacity assessment is because we now add in the additional feature of liabilities. Income assessment is just assessing how much does an individual or their households make. Liability assessment is, okay, this is how much they are making. If I subtract their liabilities, that's where I get to the repayment capacity assessment. So on the macro side of things, what we find is that credit bureau records are used as the primary source of household obligation. In fact, in most cases, in almost all cases, we find that the combo report where all liabilities are taken, where all liabilities are supposedly captured is used. Second, we find that household loan obligation to income limit is mostly at 50%, meaning that in most cases, whatever the household makes, 50% is taken as the hard and fast rule for deploying credit. And this is, of course, is in sync with the RBI regulations. Finally, we find that there are, in certain cases, internal rules employed for assessment. This may mean that you don't use 50% as a cutoff, but rather 40%, or you look at expenses or the life cycle stage of the customer and decide how much to lend to them. So that's the macro side of things. On the micro, the issue that becomes very prominent is incomplete credit bureau data, delayed updates to credit bureau records, fragmented customer records due to multiple KYC IDs, and customer retention and group formation is reportedly being a challenge at that particular point of time. So that's what we find at the micro stage. So in terms of outcomes, here we find certain peculiarities. What we find is that the use of absolute indebtedness limit is kept at 12,500. So while there is a sincere attempt to go ahead and say that, okay, if you make 2 lakhs, then we will only give you 1 lakh rupee a month. But in certain cases, due to the complexities involved, an absolute limit of 12,500 rupee of repayment burden is also used. In certain cases, it's not a universal practice. In certain cases, incomplete loan obligations get captured, partly because of how you define the household. For example, if adult children are considered or not considered, if unmarried lady is considered a part of the household or not. So these are questions whose answers tend to differ from entity to entity, and therefore, in certain cases, the loan obligation capture is not the broadest. And finally, the narrower definition of household compared to RBI requirements, because RBI makes a prescription as to how you define the household. However, what we find is that there is generally certain variations that come about, which RBI regulations may be silent, and that's where a lot of question marks come up in terms of what is to be included and what is not to be included. So in terms of numbers, so far what we looked at are broad observations, but in but in terms of numbers, what we find is that household income and loan obligation data are being collected in their entirety in around 80% of the in around 80% of the customers, but certain gaps remain. For example, if you see figure one, we'll look at what type of data was collected. So we asked the borrowers, the 771 borrowers, but certain data points were not usable. So the final sample size you see is 758. So we asked these 758 borrowers as to what type of income was collected from them. So many responded that the entire household data was collected, and that's close to 80%. So this is the dark green bar. The next shade is that only household data was collected excluding the borrower. That's around 3 to 4%. Only borrower data was collected. That's fairly lesser. That's around 2%. And certain people have responded that either no data is collected, or they don't know whether the data was collected, or they don't remember whether such data was collected. Similarly, figure 2 tells us what type of loan obligation data got collected. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go ahead and read every single chart and tell you the numbers. I'm sure you'll be able to see it from the chart that borrower households stands around 70%, and the rest gradually tapers off, with roughly 20% of people saying that either no data was collected or they do not know whether it was collected or not. Finally, figure 3, the sample size changes here because not all questions were asked. There were two modes of conversations that happened. One was an in-person mode and one was telephonic. So in the telephonic, the samples were a little smaller, and in telephonic, not all questions got asked. So therefore, the sample changes slightly. Here, the question is around whether customers face difficulties in providing information or submitting documents for repayment capacity analysis. And in almost all the cases, they say that no, there were no difficulties. In very rare cases, do they say that too many documents or other problems were fixed. So this is what we find in terms of repayment capacity assessment. Moving on to the next theme, it's around pricing and competition. So when we speak to the stakeholders, what we found is that price cap removal was viewed mostly positively. This is specifically true given the backdrop of the regulations. There were rising costs of fund, increasing operational costs, and losses from COVID-19 pandemic. So therefore, price removal was viewed mostly positively. One thing that we observed is that risk-based pricing, insofar as, okay, if somebody has a lower credit score, they have to pay a higher risk premium vis-a-vis someone with a better credit score. That's not really something that is being observed in the sample that we studied. Finally, when we asked customers whether or not they felt that interest rates have gone up, many actually did not feel that interest rates had gone up. And even those who felt that interest rates have gone up, they were apparently insensitive to such rates because they were not making decisions in terms of whether to borrow from the MFI on the basis of their interest rates. On competition, what we find is that there is a intense competition in the sector. MFIs are going deep instead of wide, insofar as they're doubling down on the geographies they are present in instead of going to, say, untouched geographies, which admittedly aren't really those many in the sector. Finally, customer retention has become a challenge because many customers tend to move from one lender to another. And we also find that many of the respondents discuss that there is a need to reinstate previous cap on number of lenders. because it's not always just the total outstanding that impacts, but also the number of loans a household has, insofar as the cognitive toll it takes on the borrowers. So we do see calls to that effect as well. On the right, there are certain codes insofar as the different pricing and competition parts are concerned. So, as I'm sure everybody would be aware, there was a time when it was discussed that MFI pricing may not be the best out there. So, one managing director of a medium-sized MFI mentions that how do you even calculate what is an exorbitant price? And do we even know that borrowers are price sensitive? And if that is not what the borrower is looking for, then if we are competing on the parameters where the borrower is looking for, what's exactly the problem? Similarly, there are other such anecdotal pieces of conversation that we have referenced on the right and lower side as well. So I'll move to the next um, slide, which is on disclosures, fair practices code.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Actually, can you go? Yeah, there is one quote written by one field officer from Karnataka. Can you
Mm.
please elaborate what he's trying to say into this?
Right. So what they're saying is whether we find customers or not, we keep running into one or two MFI staff since 10 or 15 MFIs operate in the same region and keep doing house visits to check if there is any loan requirement. So what they're saying is that in Karnataka, there was some amount of push um, sales that was happening, partly because not all the MFIs now, for context, then here when a person is being called an MFI, it's not necessarily a licensed entity to begin, because we know in Karnataka there were plenty of unregulated entities masquerading as MFIs as well. So what they're saying is that if there were more MFIs, so to speak, going door to door than there were customers needing the loans, and that's why there was a high concentration of providers within the district. So that's what the field officer from Karnataka is looking for. Does that answer?
Okay, right. Thanks.
Thank you. Right. I'll also request others to chime in case there are any questions. But moving to the next slide, which is on disclosures, fair practices code, and staff training. What we find is extremely positive on this side, which is that all the disclosures are being made, and these are not just being made in terms of um, that the document is handed over, but this is also being made in terms of people being walked through the documents. We see that there is a continued practice of compulsory group training and group recognition training. These practices do continue. We also find, however, that disclosures may not be the best tool for customer awareness, because in certain cases, they don't remember where the disclosures are, or in certain cases, they don't remember what the features were. Although this is in sync with RBI's mandate, whether the customer is getting benefited from it or not is a question mark that sort of needs further probing. In terms of fair practices code and staff training, what we find is that staff are provided initial training and also periodic refreshers. Internalization of training is somewhat ambiguous because a lot of the people are learning on the job and asking their peers how to handle certain situations. But that is to be expected when you're looking at staff churn the way there is an internal processes being different for different entities. Standardization and monitoring tools are mostly used. High attrition is a prevalent issue, like I mentioned earlier, and there is a linkage gap between staff conduct and performance assessment, insofar as that there are no pressures in terms of performance assessment because of which staff may go ahead and do some ill conduct, may engage in some ill conduct. So that's a positive rather than a negative. So that's what we find on disclosures, fair practices code, and staff training. In terms of insights from the customers, so here around 80 to 90% of the surveyed customers report that they received all loan-related disclosures and documents. Almost 90% people received the fact sheets. Almost over 90% people received the repayment schedule. Similarly, close to 80% people received the loan agreement. In certain cases, there are not provided or don't knows as well, but the numbers are fairly small. But in terms of if you look at quality of engagement, which is how will a customer rate their experience with the MFI, is notably clustered on the two ends. Generally, if somebody asks that how did you like, let's say, an ice cream, and you do this survey on 100 people, you will find that most people will sit somewhere in the middle ground. So it's a normal type distribution where the middle ground is where the highest population tends to be. Here, the middle ground population tends to be very small. What we find is that most people actually say it's very good or good. That's over 50%. That's close to 52%. Another, say 7-8% are saying that, okay, it is agreeable. So that's the midpoint. But then there is also a sizable population that do say that there are negative experiences, poor experiences as such. Going to the next theme, which is on grievance redress. What we find is that the grievance redress, that is GRM mechanisms, details are made available to all the customers. There tends to be generally two types of GRM. There is a centralized toll-free number and a more localized contact point with the branch or regional level contact. The GRM escalation pathway, which is in case your grievance is not resolved, where do you go, and so on, all the way up to the highest authority, that is the RBI ombudsperson, is also created in certain cases. So in terms of insights, what we find from talking to the customers is that most people are able to understand the context of their loans, which is comprehension of loan documents. Most people also say that those loan documents were explained, and which is where when we look at grievance redress, whether or not they were explained where to go for grievance redress, whether or not they know where grievance redress can be assessed, most customers again say that yes, they know that where they have to go in case of a grievance. Moving to the next point, which is around repayments and recovery. What we find is that center meetings remain the primary point of collection, and different forms of persuasion are used to recover dues. And I'll come to these different forms of persuasions in just a bit. In terms of micro, the problems are around migration-induced non-availability. Many of the customers are seasonal insofar as they tend to migrate often intrastate in order to, sorry, often interstate in order to work. And therefore, there are plenty of cases where because of migration, they are not available for repayment. There is a general deterioration in the group culture. There is a slight uptick in fraud and ringleader issues as well. And then there are hostile recovery situations. So when we say hostile recovery situation, one of our conversations with the loan officer was that it is often possible that you will face people who will be threatening the use of violence or reaching out to local administration, police, or otherwise, and making claims that will essentially put the person, the MFI officer, in jeopardy. So they have faced such circumstances, and there was a case where one person was even threatened with a knife. So that's the micro side of things. But at the same time, the converse is also there in certain cases, which is that house visit to make recoveries, although is something that is not um, encouraged as such, but that does happen. And in another case, use of naming and shaming tactics, insofar as one or two loan officers in certain cases did mention that we will have to take the names of the people who are defaulting. And they realize that if they take the names of the people who are defaulting in broader group, there is a social pressure that is going to come about. They also express the hurdles that comes with the recovery targets and as well as the fact that the regulations that exist. For example, one field officer from Tamil Nadu mentions that they willfully default on repayments and use the rules of collection to their advantage. For example, they go to work early in the morning and return only after 7 to 8 p.m. in the evening, then insist that we should not visit them after 7 p.m. That's a claim. This is also based on anecdotal local knowledge because the loan officer knows what sort of work that the individual is engaged in and what the general working hours are. So it's a somewhat of a mixed bag that we see in this context. In terms of repayments, the first question that we asked is around how are repayments acknowledged, whether it is formal, and by formal we mean that there is a separate written and an SMS. So it can be that there is a printed slip that comes out that says, okay, on this date, this customer has repaid this amount. Or it can be a centralized message from the server saying an SMS saying, I have received the sum of XYZ from the customer. So that's fairly formal because there are electronic records being mentioned. The other case we call semi-formal because this is where the loan cards are being signed. And in certain cases, there were conversations around somebody doesn't not signing the loan cards or somebody signing the loan cards, but later that loan card signature coming into dispute once the person has resigned, once the earlier loan officer has resigned. But if you see both of these features, the formal and the semi-formal type of acknowledgement, that is over 95%. In the other cases, what we look at is, are people facing difficulties when it comes to repaying? So what we find is that around 14% of the customers reported difficulties with repayments. But what is interesting is to note why are they facing these difficulties. So on the left-hand chart, that is the figure 16, you're seeing the number of people who are saying that they have faced difficulties in making repayment. On the right two side, you see what are the coping strategies they're employing. Insofar as if an individual is facing a difficulty, what do they do to repay? They often borrow from friends and family. They can even borrow from money lenders. They, in certain cases, borrow from other MFIs and so on. But why are they facing this difficulty? In 32% of the cases, this is due to health emergency. In 33% of the cases, this is due to reduced income. In around 12.5% of the case, it's due to delayed income. And again, around the 17.5% of case due to loss of work. So if you see the livelihood segment, that is fairly high. That's almost 50%. So over 50%, close to 60% of the people are facing difficulties in repayment, primarily because of their employment situation, their work situation. And the rest, 32 to 33% of the people are facing difficulties because of certain health emergencies. Going to the next slide, we also look at folks who have defaulted, customers who have defaulted. And there what we find is that the reason of difficulty remains more or less the same. That is health emergencies, reduced income, delayed income, loss of work. But what we also find is that there are certain recovery practices that are in some cases being used. For example, use of violence or threat of violence is very rarely used, with less than, say, 5%, 5 to 7% of the customers reporting that. Publish your name, again, not that frequent. Harassed relatives, friends, co-workers, again, not that frequent. Persistent, untimely calls and use of uncalled for language, threatening or abusive language. That's something that is indeed reported, but just to reiterate the context, the sample size is not that high. So it's just 27 people. So that's part number one. Part number two, these are 27 people who are in default, right? So this is not coming from a regular customer. These are coming from customers who are already in default. And there is a lot of always, of course, subjectivity involved in how certain things are perceived, but the numbers are what they are. So this is on the default side of things. And finally, we go to debt distress, which is when we talk to when we talk to providers and when we are talking to loan officers, they are often saying that customers are taking on debt that they cannot handle. Use of microfinance loan for consumptive and non-productive spending is something that is indeed frequent. Reported transgressions and aggressive loan dispersal strategies are being adopted by, or rather were being adopted by certain entities in the sector, some regulated, some unregulated. Similarly, staff's perceived level of indebtedness amongst their customer bases varied. Some people said it is close to 30 to 40% of the people who are fairly over indebted. In certain cases, the number was close to 10%. So it was not a uniform number that we got from every single respondent. And call for reinstating previous caps on number of lenders, etc. That, like I mentioned earlier, was again something that was discussed. So on the right, you can see some of the features as to what the branch head from West Bengal or the branch manager from Tamil Nadu are diagnosing. So these are tacit knowledge from the field, from looking at the lives of the customers that they serve, that they are bringing to the fore. So the branch head from West Bengal remarks that customers either overestimate their returns from the money or they do not calculate at all when presented with a large sum of money like a lakh. In some cases, there are threats that if you don't take it now, the MFI won't give you the sum later. In those cases, customers don't really have an option, but they end up borrowing. The branch manager from Tamil Nadu reports that in the case of money lenders, customers have to first think and then make a decision to go to them. In case of certain MFIs, with so much competition, MFIs are approaching the customers and asking them to take loans, insofar as whether it's a demand side driven or a supply side driven loan. When someone comes to you with money, it is very difficult to think and then decide who can say no in such circumstances. So that's what the diagnosis was for the local area that the branch managers serve in case of Tamil Nadu. So that concludes the primary part of the presentation insofar as what we have. Now I'll move to the next steps. I think the assembly here would know this better than us, that there is a turbulence that is currently there in the sector. But we also realize that while the current turbulence is being addressed by various actors, whether it is Sa-Dhan or whether it is the Reserve Bank or other parties, that despite that, there is a need to go ahead and address some of the structural issues that are present. So one of those issues, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is how do you measure income? So we have been having this thought and we had a conversation insofar as what can we do in order to help this. So we have thought that there is a potential of leveraging pan-India data sets. There is a potential of leveraging field staff's heuristics, because field staff knows what is happening in their geography, what a typical occupation in a typical district makes, and so on. Or can we corroborate with assets? So technology, data, heuristics, personas, all of these can be created in order to better enable market providers measure income. Are all liabilities indeed accounted for? This is a question insofar as are we getting the details of all the liabilities? Here again, field staff's heuristics, technology insofar as what are the typical loans that people have outstanding, whether formal or informal, etc., may come into play. Finally, whether the 3 lakh income is appropriate pan-India here, looking at macroeconomic data, it is to understand what should be such a number for different states and different regions and different geographies is possible. These are, of course, aspects that we at Dvara Research believe we can contribute towards. But we also recognize that to do these alone will not really be possible. And by alone, I mean not by alone, I mean by a specific microfinance entity. Because for a single microfinance entity to do these tasks at a scale that is required, it'll A, be prohibitively expensive, and B, there are other externalities insofar as one person doing it better may impact the other person's ability to lend to them. So we believe that as a group, perhaps there is a case to be made for everybody to gather and try working on these structural problems, because although the turbulence may pass, but the structural issue something can definitely help, can definitely benefit from addressing. So that brings me to the end of the presentation as such. I'll request my colleagues, Priyadarshini and Anjali, to kindly add anything if there is, and open the floor to questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Vijiraj. And I don't have anything to add, but we are very happy to take questions if you have any questions about the material that we have just presented.
I have two questions. Question number one, were there any inputs on the center meetings and how it's progressing, helpful, not helpful? That's the question number one. Second is any views and feedbacks and inputs on the utilization of loan? Any directional views or anything that you all heard or gathered during the survey?
Yes. So on your first point around center meetings, I'll go back a little bit. So if you see, so we see that there's a continued practice of CGT center meetings that are happening. Yes. But there are also instances where providers are telling us that center meetings, there is a slight deterioration in the group culture. So that you can see here that the group culture is slightly getting weakened. So that is a conversation that did happen. Insofar as what exactly is driving it, there are different perspectives there too. Some of it is residual impact of the COVID pandemic. Some of it might be because of the employment situation. People are focused a lot more on gaining their employment. So there are different perspectives as to why this is happening. In terms of the second question, which is the use of loans. So yes, these are again items that did come up, but they came up very mildly, which is why these are not discussed here in any great detail. So if you see here, you see that there are certain CEOs who are mentioning that microfinance loans for consumptive and non-productive spending is something that is happening to some extent. But again, these are off the cuff comments. But we do have certain data around how that trajectory has been changing. But that's not from this study. That is from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which basically looks at the entire country and does a survey there.
Yeah, myself, Prasad from Ashram. I have no question. So, have you heard about anything, governments, why the governments are not come forward to address these issues where the people are making hesitations, even though they are they are not given any specific statements. You are taken the loan, you need to pay that amount. Why this is not happening? Have you listened? Is there any of your surveys? Because all across, wherever it is happening, pan India level, we are seeing that one. Even RBI also very silent on that. Governments also very silent on. Ultimately, the hit and stress will be taken by the organizations. In terms of, if you see that Karnataka, even though people are having the specific rules and regulations with RBI certificate, proper shops and establishment license, labor certificate, everything, whatever we are saying that, but government people are not at all understanding that. Simply, they are the middleman is making money by taking the question of the cause. Whatever is the incidents that happen, the people will be making the money.
Okay, let's hear from Dheeraj.
Right. So, Mr. Prasad, the time frame of the study was such that the concerns that you're raising were not that prevalent at that particular point of time. So, because I'll again reiterate, like this is early 2024 to mid 2024. And when we spoke with the field officers, we discussed generally their experiences. As to why the government did not do it, I'm afraid the study did not cover that subject. So, therefore, it will be very difficult for me to shed a light on that. Apologies.
Hi, this is Sajid from Credit Manabe, Hyderabad. So thanks for the lovely presentation. But I would like to know one thing, like what is in your opinion, the group culture is getting deteriorated? Is there any specific reasons like or like observations you had during your like study, research study?
Right. So, what we did during our study was we spoke with the customers one-on-one and either in person or over telephone. And we spoke with, again, the loan officers one. So we unfortunately did not really have a direct center stage view of the group dynamics and how the groups were progressing, so to speak. So the views that we do have, however, are a synthesis of the observations that either the MFI CEOs have made or the or the staff members who are the loan officers of the MFIs they have made. And for them, there were broadly two aspects at play. Aspect number one would be that because of the pandemic, there was this there was this period where they didn't have to come in a group altogether and they could just make their repayments. So there is a general hesitation somewhat that is there still, which is residual impact being carried forward from the pandemic days. So that's part A. Part B is also that they are now looking for work much more frequently than otherwise. So they are spending a lot more time otherwise what they used to do, say, pre-pandemic. And therefore, the group cohesion to some extent is minimized. So these are broadly what we are hearing from the crowd. Of course, there are certain other hypotheses at play as well, which is that when you start thinking of when you start giving somebody 10 loans or 15 loans, we understand that that may be just 1% of the customer base. But when there are so many loans that an individual has to juggle between, then they are essentially part of those 10 or so many other, uh, so many other, let's say, groups. And that's why the sanctity of the group somewhat diminishes. But this is not a line of discussion that we engaged in very deeply. What I'm doing is I'm just summarizing some of the observations from the.
Okay, thank you. But like perhaps like I don't know, please correct me if I'm wrong. See, like earlier, the fundamental of microfinance was like money should go to the group and the group should distribute to the clients, individual clients. But we as an MFI perhaps like that kind of arrangement is not there today. Even though group is there, but money goes to directly to each of the individual customers. Do you think that that is the case? Because absolutely like if that is the case, the group cohesion, group pressure of repayment, absolutely not there.
I mean, I hear the argument you're making. However, I think the study did not really focus on this aspect. We were predominantly looking at the impact of the regulatory changes. Therefore, it'll be a little difficult for me to conjecture at this stage.
No problem.
So I
Thank
do
you.
apologize for that.
Sanjeev, I just wanted to correct you. In fact, this money going to the group and group distributing the money to the members, it happens only in SHGs. In SHGs, the group is linked with the bank. So the money goes to the group and then money is dispersed to the individual members. But microfinance institutions always, the group was a coercive, is basically a social collateral, but always the dealing was individual. So the money used to go directly to the borrower's account. That is right from the beginning. That was a model. So probably you are getting confused with SHG.
No, like I'm not confused. I know like when microfinance started, I'm there in the sector from 2000. So I know like because the very fundamental of microfinance it was that like because if money goes to the group and the earlier periods of late like it has gone to a different cycles and now microfinance what it was meant now it is not the same microfinance. You can say the practitioners, the regulators, whoever like all the stakeholders. But I was just wondering why like the group culture has deteriorated. I was thinking like could be that is one of the things because all started from see whether you say SAG or JLG doesn't matter. End of the day, today what we are finding absolutely no peer pressure as far as particularly if you talk about the repayment. Absolutely no, like everybody is interested, like please talk about my repayment. If I have repaid, that's fine. I'm part of this XYZ group, that's fine, but other members, you deal with them. So that is the context I was coming from. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dvijraj, can you hear me? Yeah. So one question from me, I see that around 40 to 50% of the participants mentioned their experience as poor, right? If you go back to one of those slides, what were the main reasons when they say, what do we mean by poor? Is it the abusive language, harassment? What exactly is the definition of this?
Right. So this was a question which was more of a standalone question towards the end. That,
Mhm.
okay, you have interacted with a MFI for so long. What is your perception? What is your
Mhm.
perception of the MFIs?
Mhm.
And this is not only with just the MFI, but specifically on the MFI staffs.
Mhm.
Right. So we do not have precise data insofar as what is driving it.
Mhm.
I doubt it will be the abusive language or anything because the sample size for that is fairly small. That sample size is 28. So those are not like those 28 people will not skew it to this extent. So
Mhm.
I think here the two extremes most likely are driven by just idiosyncratic factors. And more interestingly, what I can also tell you is that this is not a universal pattern. Insofar as the 10 MFI customers we spoke to, it's not that for two, everything is green and for two, everything is red, which is why we are seeing it this way. So we don't have the precise information as to what the drivers are. It was a more of a it was a survey question in the end to just understand what their experiences were like.
Yeah, because in my view, when I'm trying to link it with the other observations which we have in different slides, where we are saying there is a slight observation that the group culture is not being followed, the center meetings are there, but maybe there is a slight variation where it's not happening. It's not matching with that, where we are saying that there is a slight deviation which might be acceptable. But when you ask the overall experience, there is a 40% gap. So which means that entire dissatisfaction around customers is building up through variety of those reasons and something which is causing, quite a lot of distress as well. And this relationship, which is, getting diluted between, what it was a couple of years ago and where we are post-COVID, especially post-COVID. Because there's another slide where we are saying that around 14% face difficulties in repayment, correct? And that number is not, yeah, it's a rolling number. So it's not that this month that 14% is different. The next month, some may overlap, but then there will be a big percentage which will be different. And then that overall experience might lead to that 40-50% poor experience or dissatisfaction. Because the reasons that you mentioned are very valid, in the economy or the consumer base that MFIs have will had these issues in past. It's nothing new, and will have these issues in future also. Health emergencies still remain one of the key reasons that the over-indebtedness rises. There are irregular incomes, reduced incomes. So these cases, and given they are part of the, like almost all of them are part of informal economy. But this is true across the spectrum, correct? In last 20-30 years of microfinance industry. And then this shift in the experience, although the customer parameters, sure, there is the climate change, there is wages issue, lower, no correction post-COVID. But then many of those parameters remain same, but the relationship drastically deteriorated over last couple of years. So I was trying to just was curious because going back to what Sanjay was also mentioning, as per a recent study that we did on ground and our experience, the social ties, many people don't even want to go in a group setting because it's leading to social issues. The social ties are also breaking. So yeah, so I don't know if we can know more about it, the experience, why it's happening would be better.
So I think you made some fairly valid points, but unfortunately for me to sort of say like whether this is a one-time exercise, right? So it's a snapshot at a given point of time as to what the customer experiences are. Whether the customer experiences have actually uh, become more positive or become more negative, that's not really a question that, let's say, this data point can answer on its own, in standalone, of course. So, and I do hear the other arguments that you're making, and all fairly valid. I think it definitely merits us to keep looking at the sector and trying to understand what is happening so that we are perhaps able to answer these questions and make these correlations a little more stronger, look at the causal pathways. But at this stage, the type of data that we have, I will sort of hesitate drawing those conclusions just yet. But I would love to look at the data that you guys have collected, and perhaps that can help us also understand the situation better. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Dichraj, this is Neeraj from Empower Microfinance.
Yeah.
In your experience, customers expressing their willingness, this my question is related to repayment. Customer choosing which option is better for customer, is a cash mode of repayment or non-cash? That is one. And second, in that survey, any customers express their desire to go on the auto debit mode. So can you say something on this?
I'm afraid, Biraj, these are not questions that we looked at in terms of whether a digital or a cash payment will be more favorable for them. So therefore, it'll be difficult for me to comment on the basis of the survey at this stage.
Any other questions? Suggestions, comments?
I think, Gigi, sir, as you asked, like, I think, Gujarat, this is more than a comment than a question, because, and this is good that the slide that you have open, a lot of issues that we have been seeing on ground, which are related to, frauds, are somehow linked with the semi-formal issues, semi-formal acknowledgement, right? Wherever there is a formal mechanism to acknowledgement, the observation is that cases are less, but semi-formal is a big reason that these cases happen. So I think as a group, that's something which we all need to think about, that how do we move? Because these are like very frequently found cases where someone else has signed, or one officer stayed for a couple of months and then left, and then the entire groups. And then it directly and indirectly not only impacts one MFI or one portfolio, it has a ripple effect. Because once I lose my money, I will not repay the money which I owe even beyond that. And then it creates that mistrust in the community, in not just in my village, but in the nearby villages also. So it's a big issue, and this semi-formal is something which we need to like deal with. Also, in combination with how do we bring the more sensible and responsible behavior, where there is a lot of competition, and it's like eating from others' pie, but in the end creating a mess for everyone, including the customer, because like you rightly pointed out, we are dealing with a community which is not financially literate, which is always in the need of money. And if there are threats or suggestions like, if this money may not come to you tomorrow, eventually if I am them, I would grab that opportunity whether the utilization happens properly or not. And there is a lot of, and I think as a sector, we need to accept that a lot of it is consumption loan. A lot of it is consumption loan, because this is uneven economy. It's not that the monthly incomes are same across 12-month spectrum. So how do we acknowledge it, and then kind of like ingrain it into our system that it's not income generation loan? What is the realistic number? What do we need to do to be prepared, and then consider it in the overall planning?
Thank you for the comment. I think we couldn't really agree more. And I think this is a general consensus that we also found in the study, that the participants are realizing that it's not really a problem that one person can solve, because as long as there is one bad actor, then the entire industry dynamics can get skewed. Which is why I think I'll go back to the last slide of mine, which is where we are talking about that to do a lot of these things alone would be fairly difficult, but to do them together would uh, be the best possible way to avoid any negative externalities and spillovers. But thank you for the pointing.
You're welcome, Vizraj.
Yeah, I just have an observation. That's first I'd like to congratulate both Dwara and Sa-Dhan. Secondly, what's more important is I think the study gives an insight, quite deep insight, into like what are the pros and cons, what are the challenges and the issues which we are looking at, and possibly in the interest, like each of us individually might be trying to do it, but collectively also, what all can we do to strengthen the system? Because wherever we find that there are issues which can have the ripple effects, which can also transgress, can also be basically like rumor going through, especially in with the social media and all. So I think it throws a lot of challenges and also provides the insights, and also the more important part is the plus side of it. Like say how to we have withstood, the sector has withstood and then has the capability to do so. These are my observations. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
You want to say anything?
I think in case there are no other questions, perhaps in the Priyadarshini, if there is anything that you would want to add, and otherwise.
Sorry?
In case there is anything you would want to add.
No, I don't need to add anything unless there are further questions. But I just want to also thank I want to thank Gigi and Somesh and the team at Sa-Dhan for allowing us to do this work, because I think this kind of work is very, very important for gaining, as Paliwal sir just said, that it's very important for gaining a perspective on how these new regulations have been playing out. And I think we are learning that the sector is doing very sincere work in trying to implement these regulations, but these structural issues do need solving. We are at your service if you need our help in trying to solve, because we do research, we go out into the field and we try to understand the problems, and we try to bring our wealth of knowledge to solutioning for those problems. So we are ready to work with you to solve some of these issues in the coming months and years.
Right. Thank you.
Indradeep and Rijiraj and Somini and Priyadarshini from Sa-Dhan side, wanted to thank you for it was really great working with you the last year and a half. I think the report has come out well, and so to those who don't know, I mean, you had made a presentation at our national conference, which had got a lot of visibility a couple of months ago, and RBI's top team was there on stage, and they were also very pleased to see some of the findings. I mean, after all, they were the ones very keen to know what impact these regulations are having in the field. So I think this three-tier approach of seeing top management of MFIs, having consumer insights, everyone commenting on this was very useful to them as well. And also, I thank our members for giving you the access to do this, and so we could hear all different scales of our members talking about it. And I think some of the points there, the challenges and the gaps are well noted. I think we will be working on that in the next couple of months and seeing how we can resolve this. I think that's going to be our main focus. I think there are a lot of learnings from this report. So from our side, thanks again, and look forward to working with you again. And thank all the participants who were here with us. And if there's any follow-up questions, we'll be happy to, you can share with us separately, write to us. We'll be happy to answer you. And if you would like any copy of the report, of course, we can send it to you as well. Yeah. So thanks a lot once again.
Thank you, Sa-Dhan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to Nania Sahab and Paliwal Sahab. Both are on board members, so they are also part of this audience. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Closing.